The message you're about to hear was presented at our first annual minister seminar, which addressed the subject of who is true Israel and who is not. The entire seminar was recorded and is available from Scriptures for America in a 12 cassette tape album along with printed literature. The singing you're going to hear is that of the participants themselves.
It is time for Scriptures for America Worldwide with Pastor Peter J. Peters. All around the world, from the United States to Canada, Europe, Russia, South Africa, Australia, the Holy Spirit is stirring the hearts of godly Christians. The Bible says, quote, as an eagle stirreth up his nest, end quote. We invite you to stay tuned as Pastor Peter J. Peters shines the mighty light of the gospel on the source of our problems and the only solution. Please keep Scriptures for America in your prayers. And now, Pastor Peters.
The first thing I want us to do, starting off this seminar, is to approach the subject of who is Israel from an archaeological and historical standpoint. And I'm very pleased to tell you we've got as fine a man to address that subject as you'll ever get a chance to hear. And that's archaeologist E. Raymond Capt from California. Would you stand, Mr. Capt? Mr. Capt holds a Master of Arts degree in Christian History and Biblical Archaeology from Covenant College, Lake Wales, Florida, and California State teaching credentials in Biblical Archaeology and History. In addition to writing, Mr. Capt has produced and presents slide and film lectures on biblical archaeology. In 1972, he was elected a Fellow of the Society of Antiquities of Scotland. And in 1976, he received an honorary doctorate of literature. Doctor, how would you say that, please? Okay. Well, there's just one or two Latin words I don't have down yet. But he got it.
Now, I'm going to start with saying Pete Peters believes this is one of the most important questions we could face today as Christians, and I concur with that. The fact of what happened to the lost tribes of Israel. And my presentation is actually going to answer that question. That has puzzled the Bible scholars for centuries. What happened to the 10 lost tribes of Israel who disappeared about 700 years before Christ? And we have an abundance of prophecy in the Bible concerning the fate of the house of Israel, known as the tribes of Israel, but we have no noticeable record of its history in exile. The most prevailing theory has been held by leading theologians today. They simply amalgamated or integrated with the peoples of the land of their captivity, and thus are lost and gone forever. I read one historian said that in the book. But what really happened? Is that true? Well, seemingly the answer to that question can only be answered by the Assyrians themselves. But they've been out of business for 2,500 years. But surprisingly, they did keep a record of what happened to the lost tribes of Israel. In the form of cuneiform tablets, they were found in 1850, translated in 1930, and these records give the complete report of what happened to the lost tribes of Israel. Now, that's something that's been overlooked completely by Bible scholars. They tell us the tribes of Israel did not integrate with the people of the captivity, but they migrated west out of the land of captivity. And that's going to be the subject of my presentation. I know that many of you are Bible teachers and ministers. I'm going to have to ask you to bear with me, please. For the first part of my presentation will deal with a question you're quite familiar with, the story of Abraham. But perhaps you have never seen that story illustrated before. Turn on, please. All right. I want to check the focus. Is that focus good? I didn't have a chance to. Okay. Can everybody see that all right? Not blocking the rain? The story of the migration of Israel requires some background, dealing with a man called Abram, who lived in approximately 2000 B.C. Abram, with his wife Sarai, were residents of the city of Ur in the Chaldees, a city on the banks of the river Euphrates in Iraq, known as the land between the rivers, the Euphrates to the south and the Tigris to the north. This area has long been recognized by the archaeologists as one of the cradles of civilization. It was here that grew up the great empires of Assyria and Babylonia. From Ur, Abram and his family were taken by his father Terah. Terah is seen in the middle here, and Abram to one side, to Haran, where Terah died. At Haran, God told Abram to leave Haran and go into the land of Canaan, and there God would deal with him and make of him a great nation, that all the families of the earth would be blessed through him. Abram obeyed God with all his family and flocks. They trekked across the desert to Canaan. Years later, God again spoke to Abram, saying, quote, I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth, so that if a man can number the dust of the earth, then shall thy seed be numbered. In answer to Abram's complaint that he had no seed, God said, look now toward heavens, and tell the stars, if thou be able to number them, so shall thy seed be. When Abram was 60 years old, God again spoke to him, saying, reading the Bible, as for me, behold, my covenant is with thee, thou shalt be a father of many nations. Neither shall thy name any more be called Abram, but thy name shall be Abraham, for a father of many nations have I made thee. And kings shall come out of thee, and I will establish my covenant between me and thee, and thy seed after thee for an everlasting covenant. Abraham's wife Sarai is described in the Scriptures as a very beautiful woman. And indeed, she made quite a stir in Pharaoh's court when they sojourned in Egypt. Much later in life, when she was well past the age of bearing children, God promised Abraham she would have a son, and thereafter her name would be called Sarah. Sarah was delivered of a son who she was directed to call Isaac, which means laughter. Some years earlier, because she had, thought herself seemingly too old to bear children, she had laughed. But she had no heir. But anyway, by Hagar, Abraham had a son named Ishmael, whom God blessed to be the ancestor of 12 princesses. These are the 12 Arab nations of today. But God said his great covenant was not to be made with Ishmael, but with Isaac. And Ishmael and his mother Hagar were sent away. Then God tested Abraham's faith by asking him to make a burnt offering of his son Isaac. Abraham had such faith that he believed that God would provide another sacrifice or restore his son to life. And he did as God directed. The Bible tells us that Abraham stretched out his hand and took a knife to slay his son. But God said, lay not thy hand upon the lad. I know now that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son. Then God said, by myself have I sworn, saith the Lord, because thou hast done this thing, and hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, that in blessing I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thy seed as the stars in the heavens, as the sand which is upon the seashore. In thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice. Note that's unconditional. Unconditional. Abraham's family grew. Isaac fathered a son named Jacob, who in turn fathered 12 sons and 1 daughter. One night on a journey from Beersheba to Haran, Jacob slept out in the open and used a stone for a pillar. And there he dreamed a dream of a ladder that sat upon the earth, its top reaching into heaven. At the top, behold, angels of the Lord were descending and ascending. The top, God himself. The creator of the universe then said unto Jacob, thy seed shall spread abroad to the west, to the east, to the north, and to the south. In thee and thy seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Again, unconditional promise. When he awoke in the morning, stunned by his dream, Jacob anointed with oil the stone which he had used for a pillar, and said, the stone which I have used for a pillar shall be God's house. There are many today who believe, and I concur, there is evidence to support the belief that the stone that Jacob anointed is found under the coronation chair in Westminster Abbey in London. A stone which has a history traced back through Scotland, Ireland, and traditionally to Egypt, being brought there by Jeremiah with the daughters of Zedekiah, the last king of Judah. This was after the Babylonian takeover of Jerusalem. Jacob's dream of the heavenly ladder was not the only strange experience he had. Genesis chapter 22 tells of him wrestling all night with an angelical being. Although this story is allegorical or true or real, the result was that God changed Jacob's name to Israel, meaning a prince with God. Then an incident took place in Jacob's family which had great consequences. His young son Joseph was a dreamer, and he had a dream one night, which perhaps unwisely he told his older brothers. He saw them all bowing down before him. In their understandable anger and jealousy, they later sold Joseph to a group of Ishmaelites passing through their way on to Egypt. Later in life, Joseph was to be so honored for his services to the Pharaoh and the Egyptian people that he was made prime minister of Egypt, directly under the Pharaoh. But later, you perhaps remember the story how a famine in Canaan caused Jacob to send his son to Egypt to buy grain. And there they discovered they had to deal with their younger brother. They fell down on their knees before him, fulfilling Joseph's dream. Now, despite his brother's unkind actions toward him in the past, Joseph forgave them and invited them to bring their father Jacob and all their families to reside in Egypt permanently. Overjoyed at the prospect of seeing his son he thought was dead, Jacob gathered together all his goods and families and journeyed to Egypt. There he was welcomed by the inhabitants, who were pleased to see they had not only brought with them livestock on the hoof, but also the musical instruments as well. Now, the Egyptians recorded such visits, these nomadic people, on one of the wall paintings in the tombs. And what appears to be a television set here, carried by one of the men, is in fact a primitive type of harp. Now, Joseph joyfully introduces his father Jacob to the reigning Pharaoh, and Jacob, reunited with his favorite son Joseph, resided there for 15 years. But now he is ill and nearing death. As the custom was in those days, he called his sons together to give them the family blessings. As he does so, we wonder if he remembered how he deceived his father Isaac into bestowing upon him the firstborn blessing instead of on Esau, by pretending to be Esau while Esau was away hunting, a deception for which Esau's descendants have hated Jacob's descendants down through the centuries. To Joseph, who had saved his people, Jacob gave the firstborn portion, and he blessed the two sons of Joseph, saying, "Let my name be named on them," thus giving them jointly the name Israel. As he blessed the boys, he placed his right hand over the head of Ephraim the younger, instead of Manasseh the older. Joseph protested, but Jacob Israel said, "Manasseh shall become a great nation, but the younger brother shall be greater. His seed shall become a multitude of nations." He then gathered all his sons to him to bestow their blessings, and what would befall them in the latter days. Soon after this, Jacob Israel died, was embalmed in the manner of the Egyptians. His body was taken back to Canaan for burial in a cave near the town of Hebron. Now, the story of Israelites sojourned in Egypt for several hundred years. They'd been pressed into slave labor by a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph, meaning he did not remember the great works of Joseph in saving the people in his day. They escaped from Egypt under Moses, their wanderings in the desert for 40 years, and they developed into a strong fighting nation. The invasion of Canaan, that story is well known. After a series of successful battles, Israel settled down in their captured territories, and the land of Canaan was divided among the 12 tribes by the drawing of lots, between 1200 and 1000 B.C. The United Nation of Israel was formed into a kingdom by the prophet Samuel about 1020 B.C., and had Saul as its first king. Not all the land allotted to the Israelites at that time had been conquered. They were meeting stiff resistance on all sides. The Ammonites from the east were repulsed by the armies of Saul. The Philistines from the south were defeated by Saul's son Jonathan. Helped, of course, by David's successful encounter with Goliath, Although often pictured as a small little shepherd boy, he was more likely a strong, muscular man, larger than average, or he was taller than the average man could wear Saul's armor. Saul himself is noted to be taller than the average. Saul stood, they said, the Bible says, head and shoulders over the rest of Israel. Even Saul's armor was too restrictive for David, who removed it before felling a giant with a slingshot, then cutting off the giant's head with his own sword. The Philistines again invaded Israel, this time defeated Saul's army in the plain of Jezreel, slaying Saul and his sons on Mount Gilboa. When Saul's armor-bearer saw that his master was dead, he fell on his own sword and died with him. David assumed the throne about 1000 B.C. and through a series of battles subdued all the enemies of the kingdom and established a stable government. David was followed by his son Solomon, whose wisdom and leadership made the kingdom of Israel the most powerful and wealthiest of all the known world at that time. A notable instance of his wisdom was settling the claim of two women, each claiming the same babe as their own. However, all power corrupts, and Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord. He loved too many strange women. The book of Kings tells us he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. And his wives turned his heart away from God. He built for them high places and pagan altars and allowed them to make sacrifices to their idols. This was a statue of the god Moloch, the abomination of the children of Ammon. And the Lord said unto Solomon, For so much as thou hast not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I have commanded thee, I will surely rip the kingdom from thee. Upon Solomon's death, his son Rehoboam called all Israel to meet here at Shechem, the ruins you see here, in order to ratify his succession to the throne. Jeroboam, who had become a labor foreman under Solomon, asked assurances of Rehoboam if he were allowed to become king, he would lessen his father's heavy yoke of service, less taxes, less work, which was denied. And therefore 10 of the tribes refused to accept Rehoboam, and the division of the kingdom came to pass. 10 tribes under the leadership of the house of Joseph became known as the northern kingdom of Israel, with Jeroboam as their king and Samaria as their capital. 2 tribes under the leadership of the house of Judah formed the southern kingdom of Judah, with Rehoboam as their king and Jerusalem as their capital. The northern kingdom required the ancient Canaanite royal city of Megiddo. This is where the Israelites became acquainted with the worship of Isis and idols, a seductive attraction to some of the Israelites. Among the idols they worshipped was Ashtoreth, the mother goddess of Baal. This problem of worship and idols actually started during the period of the invasion of Canaan by Joshua and continued on the reign of Solomon for some time afterwards. This is the ruins of the ancient city of Shiloh, where the prophet Ahijah prophesied God's judgment on Jeroboam and his idol makers. Reading in part now from the book of Kings, chapter 14, verse 10. For you have made yourself other gods to provoke me to anger. Therefore, behold, I will bring evil upon the house of Jeroboam, and will utterly sweep away the house of Jeroboam as a man sweeps away dung till it is all gone. Idolatrous symbols, such as you see here, cause a further prophecy to be given concerning the future fate of the kingdom of Israel. Reading from the book of Kings, chapter 14. And henceforth the Lord will smite Israel as a reed is shaken in the water, will root up Israel out of this good land which he gave to their fathers, and will scatter them beyond the river Euphrates, because they have made their idolatrous symbols, provoking the Lord to anger. Here we see the ruins of the Phoenician city of Tyre, the birthplace of the infamous Jezebel, who became the wife of Ahab, the ruler of the northern kingdom of Israel, from 869 to 850 B.C. Jezebel established the cult of Baal worship, persuaded her husband Ahab to erect a pillar in honor of Ashtoreth. In this picture in Sebasti, Jordan, we see the same scene that the prophet Hosea saw, a threshing floor, chaff swirling about a winnowing fan. Now, Hosea was an 8th century prophet of the northern kingdom of Israel. He lived during the reign of Jeroboam II. Hosea prophesied the fate of Israel in Hosea 13, verses 2 and 3, which reads in part, and now they sin more and more, and make for themselves molten images, idols, skillfully made of their silver. Sacrifice to these, they say, men kiss calves. Therefore they shall be like the morning mist, or like the dew that goeth away early, like the chaff that swirls from the threshing floor. The continued worship of idols in the face of 4 warnings that God had given the Israelites in the book of Leviticus, chapter 26. If they persisted in worshiping and sinning, worshiping idols and sinning, he would invoke the 7 times punishment and cause them to be removed from their land and scattered among the heathen. That was brought into being. For the Assyrians successfully came down against the northern tribe of Israel. They came in 3 major invasions in the 9th and 8th centuries B.C. toward Karkar, through Samaria to Jerusalem, and then to Damascus. The great Assyrian Empire, symbolized by the winged bull with a great king's head, had but one major objective down through the years. Not the conquest of Israel, the conquest of Egypt. In order to achieve this, it was necessary to clear away all opposition along this pathway to their ultimate objective, the fabled cities on the banks of the Nile. Tiglath-Pileser, the first deportation of Israel from Palestine, came in 745 B.C. Tiglath-Pileser, or King Pul as the Bible calls him, led his army south and conquered most of the northern Israel and those living on the east side of the river Jordan. He deported the population en masse to Halah, Abar, the area the river goes on. Now, King Pul's records have come down to us in broken, mutilated slabs, inscribed clay tablets, which are found in the ruins of the city of Nimrud. This tablet depicts the Assyrian slingers in the army of King Pul being led by an officer. The royal annals, or records, inscribed in cuneiform, seen above, include this account of subjection of the city of Samaria. Quote, I received tribute from Menahem of Samaria. Like a bird alone he fled and submitted to me. This slab shows the Assyrian attack in the southern city of Lachish, in which the massive siege engines were battering away at the walls. In 722 B.C., the Assyrians, this time led by Shalmaneser, again invaded Israel. An inscription found in the palace of Sargon II recorded the account of one battle. Quote, I set siege to and conquered Samaria. I carried away into captivity 27,290 persons who lived there. Now these were later, others taken later, were carried away into Goshen, Golan. Now also, many were placed further east in the Media to act as buffers against the Assyrians' enemies to the south. Keep in mind that Israelites were not slaves. They were not shackled, you might say. They have free cities, they had a free government, they lived where they wanted to live in certain areas around the borders of Egypt, of Assyria. And any enemies coming against Assyria would have to naturally fight through the Israelites first, who would naturally put up a resistance. That was the matter. Of course, they had to pay tribute to the crown, probably a lot of taxes to them. We find in 721 B.C., the kingdom of Israel, which had lasted for some 200 years, had now come to an end. And the members of the 10 tribes, which had been carried away into Assyrian captivity, became known as the lost tribes of Israel. For apparently they never again emerged in world history. You know, I found in teaching this subject, many people did not know any lost tribes, didn't hear about them. I had to first establish we have some lost tribes before I can tell them what they're found. Follow me? But Sennacherib seized the throne upon the death of his father Shalmaneser, and took over the plans, again, not of Israel, but Egypt. After defeating a combined army of Egyptians and Ethiopians, he turned his attention to the southern kingdom of Judah. Sweeping up from the north, from his Egyptian campaign, he attacked Gaza, Beersheba, and finally Lachish, before then moving against Jerusalem. On a clay tablet found at Nineveh, Sennacherib records his 8 campaigns against Hezekiah, the king of Judah. He records that Hezekiah paid him tribute to a sum equal to about $1.5 million. Now, this account, recorded by Sennacherib, correlates the Bible history as we find in the second book of Kings, chapter 18, and Isaiah 36 and 37, part of which runs in part. As for Hezekiah the Judean, who did not submit to my yoke, 48 of his strong walled cities I besieged and took. 200,150 people, male and female, horses, mules, asses, camels, cattle, and sheep without number. I brought away with them and counted as spoil. Himself like a caged animal, I shut up in Jerusalem, his royal city. What he meant by that was he was unable to capture the city of Jerusalem. At this time in history, the inhabitants of Jerusalem itself were all remained of the southern kingdom of Judah. Over 5/6 of the population having been removed from their homeland by the Assyrians and taken north to the house of Israel, something overlooked by most Bible scholars. They assumed the captivity of Jerusalem to Babylon covered all the house of Judah. It didn't, not even a fifth of the people. When Assyria fell to the Babylonians in 612 B.C., it gave no comfort to the city of Jerusalem. Babylon took away over the conquest of the city and eventually effected its capture. Again, deporting its inhabitants to Babylon, they fulfilled God's warning to them in Leviticus chapter 26. If they persisted in sinning and worshiping idols, they would receive the same treatment as the house of Israel in the north received. In Babylon, the remnant of Judah were held captive for some 70 years before being released by Cyrus to return when he in turn conquered Babylon, returned back to Jerusalem. The return to Babylon marks the end of Hebrewism. You should remember that. In other words, it marked the end of all ties with the Old Testament. It marked the beginning of Judaism, which today is erroneously linked with Christianity. The people who call themselves Judean Christians don't realize what they're saying. It's not Christian at all. Today we know Babylon is in ruins, fulfilling Bible prophecy again. Now Josephus records some interesting facts about the returning Israelites to Jerusalem. Only out of some 49,000 of the original 600,000 taken captive actually returned. And with them were many Babylonians. Now most of them never returned, but many have migrated west, we believe, to search the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And of course some stayed in for business reasons. Our ancestors were all good, making money. They wanted to stay in Babylon, live under their system. But he also recorded that the returning Israelites brought from Babylon many Babylonian customs and religion, which explains why Jesus later criticized some of the priesthood in Jerusalem for not following the laws of Moses, but instead they're following the Babylonian traditions of the elders, known as the Babylonian Talmud. Now, I was very interested to read Dr. Kratz, who wrote the book called The History of the Jews. This is 1800 and something. He wrote the Babylonian Talmud, quote, is the heart and soul of modern Judaism. What do we have with the Babylonian Talmud? We have the Torah, which is the Palestinian Talmud. Josephus also wrote that many Babylonians accepted Cyrus' invitation to migrate with the remnant of Judah, and they did. And they, together with the Edomites who had occupied Jerusalem during those 70 years of captivity, they all became part of the nation of the Jews, a name not having been applied to any branch of the Hebrew people prior to the Babylonian captivity. So it was in the midst of a multi-racial nation that the few true racial Hebrews, Judeans, started work on the restoration of the walls and the temple. Change slide. Regarding now the house of Israel, Hosea and Amos, who foretold the Israelites' captivity, also made it very plain it would not remain lost, but eventually be restored as a nation. Why many ministers who read out of these books don't read that into there, I don't know. It's a mystery to me. Now, if secular historians have found no mention of the exiled Israelites in ancient records, we now know why. It is simply because the Assyrians called them by other names, not their right name. One example is found on the Assyrian stone monument that stands in the Assyrian galleries in the British Museum. It's called the Black Obelisk, inscribed are the annals or records of Shalmaneser III, king of Assyria. On one side is this inscription of Jehu, king of Israel, paying tribute to Shalmaneser. And the inscription reads, this is Jehu, the son of Omri. Before the captivity, Israel was called Beth, meaning house, Kumri, by the Assyrians, meaning house of Omri. The word Omri in Hebrew begins with the consonant, Agan, commonly called Gain, pronounced with a soft G. So The Israelites who had pronounced Omri as Gomri. When they went into exile, they ceased to use the name Israel, meaning ruler with God, became known as Beth Cumri, or house of Cumri. Now, to trace the fate of the kingdom of Israel, the obvious thing to do is to start our search for where they were last found, last record. Ancient Assyria and Media. This is now in northern Iraq and Iran. Now, to trace the fate of the kingdom of Israel, the obvious thing to do is to start our search for where they were last found, last record. Ancient Assyria and Media. This is now in northern Iraq and Iran. One of the first clues, the ultimate fate of the lost tribes of Israel, was found in the archaeologists excavating the Syrian Royal Library at Nineveh, the ruins of Sargon II. They did not realize the importance of what they found at that time. This is about 1850. They were in the form of cuneiform tablets, such as you see here. Now, these are the actual tablets, not copies. I photographed these in the British Museum. Got permission to use them. Now, these were discovered, I said, over a century ago, translated and published in 1930 by Professor Rotterman at the University of Michigan. Their relevance to Israel was completely overlooked by him and his staff because of in total disorder and among some 1,400 other texts. What they did, went through about 20,000 tablets. Everyone that had a king's name, Ashurbanipal, Sargon, any name like that, they lay them aside. They got all through, they put those in a collection, and that's what Rotterman worked on. And they called the book he published The Royal Correspondence of the Syrian Empire. It took me about 5 years to locate that book and gave me the first clue where to go in the British Museum and find these tablets. I was told, old British Israelite told me about one. 5 years before I could actually trace it down by finding a book in a library, an old bookstore in Hollywood, Santa Barbara. And I could take that book to the British Museum. Oh, we can cross-reference that with this. They tell, oh, we know where they are in the packing box so-and-so down the basement. They haven't been open for 75 years. What do you want with them? I explained what I'm doing about my book, Missing Link. I'd worked on that book at the time. And I said, you're going to create an image in those tablets. Maybe we better get them out and photograph them. We'll pay for the negatives. You just buy the prints. That cost me $450, just the prints. Now, these are the actual tablets. Now, one of these tablets is dated 707 BC, referred to a land called Gamir, G-M-I-R, Gamir, the very area which the Israelites had been placed only 14 years earlier. Now, Gamir, or Gimra, is evidently a corruption of Gomri, the Syrian name for Israel, formed by the inversion of the final syllables R-I to I-R. This is very common in Assyrian writings. Now, the tablets were reports made by Assyrian frontier posts to the king. These are spies keeping track of what's happening to the Israelites in their captivity. They stated the armed forces of Urartu, that is near Ararat, were invading the district south of Lake Urmia in Media. The report continues, quote now, when the king of Urartu came into the land of Gamir, his army was routed, obviously by the Gamiriya. All historians now agree that Gamiriya is the same people who 30 years later, in the reign of Ursha Hayden, were called Gimra. Another report stated the Gamira counterattacked, entered the city of land of Urartu in the upper Euphrates, captured all their army commanders. And these reports not only confirm the archaeological finding of the invasion of Urartu during that same period, for the first time identified the people responsible for the invasion. However, the archaeologists made a mistake there. They call them Mani or Medes. Now, how many of you this book, by the way, Missing Links Discovery, if you're interested in this subject, this is available from the pastor here. Missing Links Discovery Assyrian Tablets. I'll give you a little idea. We've got this book here. The book has Assyrian writings, English translations. Now, I've been told that the Mania and the Gamir are the same people. That's what Rotterman come up with. But I found one of them said this. They tell the king sent an order to his troops. Enter not into the midst of the Mania. All the troops should not enter. But the cavalry invade the Camirians who have spoken, saying this. That the Mani pertain to you, is not in the first one. This is a lie. They are offspring of outcasts. They recognize neither the oath of the God or human being. Let the wagon cars take up position on one side of the pass, take plenty of the plain of Manna first, then come back to the past, and then go to the land of Cimmerians. Now, I'm using the word Cimmerian instead of Gomorrah, aren't I? Professor Waterman identified that word, Gomorrah, as meaning Cimmerians, Celts. That's how close he came to recognizing the Israel. But he fell for Josephus, and he also fell for another famous historian. They made a mistake and thought they came from Japheth. They're Japhetic people, not Israel. They came, like they came so close. I found actually two sources here. They also referred to these Gomorrah as strangers to the area, and a barbarian whose homes are far off. So they didn't actually belong there. The Messiah are not the Gomorrah. That's what I want to make. A later report now reports this. The second year of Esarhaddon, the king of Israel, king of Assyria, this now is about 679 BC, the Gomorrah, as the Israelites were called at that time, rose up in rebellion under leader Trespa, and later fled westward, pursued by the Assyrian army. Now this, what I'm reading here, is not what I say, what the tablets say. The tablets record that the Assyrian army pursued the Gomorrah, recaptured some of them, most of them escaped. And that, to me, started the western migration of the tribes of Israel at this point in history. One group of Gomorrah captured Sardis, the capital. And soon after, they were, about 30 years, they were driven out, and most of them went around the Black Sea or across the Black Sea to the Crimea area. There's a picture of someone across and someone around. Now we have a double witness. The Greeks reported these same activities in their history writings. They called the Gomorrah Kimmeroi. You translate Kimmeroi in English, you get Cimmerians. And we all know the Celts come from Kimmeria. Now, one branch of the Cimmerian Israelites moved out of the Asia Minor to settle down what is called southern coast of Russia, called in the book of Ezra, or Sereth, or the mountains of Sereth. Read 2nd Ezra sometime. He also mentions the river Euphrates, which I quoted a minute ago. Now, there's but one major pass through the mountain barrier of the Caucasus, the Daria Pass, known locally even today as the Pass of Israel. Today. After Babylon conquered Assyria Empire in 612 BC, the Babylonians then invaded that part of Media that the Gomorrah had not escaped, had settled. Now, the Babylonians had yet a further name for the Gomorrah. They called them Iskuzi. Now, a name, the root is always being SK, notice that, a name easily deduced from Israel's original name, the house of Isaac, thus further identifying them as Israelites. Another major archaeological clue to tracing the lost tribes of Israel was found on the side of this hill in northern Persia, along the old caravan trail between Ecbatana and Babylon, in the form of inscribed writings on a rock face about 300 foot above the base. These inscriptions were carved in Akkadian, Elamite, and Old Persian languages, and all three told the same story like the Rosetta Stone. The inscription showed that the Babylonian name Gomorrah was written Saka in the Persian inscription, proving that the Gomorrah and the Saka were the same people. Now the Greek also referred these people and called these people Scythians. Isaac, Saka, and Scythian, all these have the same basic root, SC or SK, as in Scott. Now these inscriptions, Darius the Great boasts of having taken some of the Gomorrah or Saka prisoners about 500 BC. Carved in the stone are shown some of the Saka prisoners bearing tribute to the king. Note the comical caps they're wearing, identical to those found worn by the Goths and Scyths of Western Europe. It is important to re-emphasize the same root forms of various names Israel were called during their period of captivity. Isaac, Sakai, Saka, Scythian, Iskuzi. The root forms I mentioned before being SK. The word Saxon has the same form derived from Isaacson, the sons of Isaac. Why hasn't our leading historical theologians and study of history find these clues? They've been around here all the time. Just overlook them. Archaeology has not only identified these Scythians as members of the lost tribes of Israel, but for the first time has provided us with realistic, lifelike pictures of what our ancestors, the ancient Hebrews, looked like. Unlike the stylized pictures drawn by the Egyptians, or formalized stone carvings made by the Babylonians and Persians, excavated from Scythian tombs north of the Caucasus are skillfully made gold work showing the everyday life of the Scythians. Here, 2 of them are astride their horses. Peter the Great owns this collection. It's toured the United States some years ago in Britain. 2 Scythians here are fighting back to back using bows and arrows. Reminds us of the little tribe of Benjamin. They had 280,000 men of valor who bear shields and drew the bow. In this scene, a warrior on horseback, accompanied by his squire, is engaged in a fight with another Scythian, recalling the frequent infighting between the tribes before the captivity. Even the day afterwards in England, Scots and English. The life of the Scythian was not always fighting. They raised cattle, they did farming. Here a Scythian is milking a ewe. Scenes from everyday life are shown on this gold base. Here a warrior is stringing his bow exactly like we do it in modern archery today. Another one giving first aid to a companion wounded in battle. And Scythians got toothaches just like everyone else. Here too they've been distracted. But the return to our tracing the Israelites. Under pressure from under pressure from the Medes and the Babylonians, Persians, the Scythians, our eastern branch of the Israelites, migrated north around the Black Sea, coming into collision with the Cimmerians, a western branch of the Israelites, who had settled in the Carpathian regions. Their kinship was lost during the past centuries. Ensuing battles ended with the Cimmerians being forced out and moving west. The Cimmerians broke into 2 major groups. Now remember, I'm only giving the main groups. There's a lot of side divisions we have found in archaeology. This is the main division. The larger part moving up the Danube River Valley, arriving at its source in South Germany between 600 and 100 BC. Now, Roman historians call these people Celts. A small group moved into the sparsely populated region of the Baltic Sea. The Romans called them Cimbri, a abbreviation of the name Cimmerian. Now, between the 4th and 1st centuries BC, the Sarmatians, a mixed non-Israelitish people, partly Iranian, were pushing westward. They moved into the area of the then prosperous Scythian nation. Continued warfare consequently drove the Scythians out of their land west, and the majority northward toward the Baltic Sea between 400 and 100 BC. In the north, the Scythians pushed the Cimbri northwest to Jutland and Denmark, the coast of Holland, while the Celts expanded in all directions, many pouring into Britain to form the bedrock of the British race. In about 300 BC, the Celts invaded Italy. They sacked Rome. Others migrated back into Asia Minor, where they were called Galatians by the Greeks. Now, some of these Celts, they left Rome, they settled in the northern part of Lombardy. And some of the Lombardy Italians today are Celts, originally. We now know that some of Paul's letters to the Galatians were to his kinsmen Israelites, or at least the descendants of the early Galatians, although called Gentiles by modern Bible translations. The Gentiles could mean Greek, could mean nations, non-Jewish. As the Sarmatians now occupied Scythia in South Russia, there's a tendency to confuse them with the western moving Scythians we see here. Now, for people who often identified the name of their homeland, the Romans had a problem. The people in Scythia are not Scythians, The Scythians are way up here now. They solved the problem by introducing the name German, the word for the meaning genuine Scythians. Now the word Germanus, or Germani, is the Latin word for genuine. So the word of Germany originally meant just genuine Scythians. Now from this time forward, we find the name Scythian was dropped in the Roman records, except for the outlying parts in favor of German and Sarmatians. The Cimbri were eventually driven out of northwest Europe. One group migrated into Ireland, but they were called Scots. Another crossed the North Sea into northern Britain to form the nation of the Picts. Further south, a Celtic expedition entered Italy again, nearly wiped out this time the Roman legions. These aren't Celts, these are the Cimmerians. Another group made their way into Spain to be known as the Iberians, the Gaelic name for Hebrew. Now, during the succeeding centuries, the Scythian Germanic people broke up into many divisions, I believe possibly in some instances, in their original Israel tribal families. They came in there as Angles, Saxons, Jutes, Danes, Vikings, to name just a few. Now, between 450 and 600 AD, some Angles and Saxons invaded Britain, mixed, and then they became known as Anglo-Saxons. The Celtic Scots, for the most part, moved into northern Britain and established the nation of the Scot. Many settled in North Wales, the Isle of Man, the Scilly Islands off the coast of Cornwall. Now, many Germanic tribes poured into the lands of the south, vacated by the Celts, and established the Gothic nations, the Vandals, Lombards, Franks, Burgundians, Visigoths, Ostrogoths. These Scythian Germanic tribes formed the modern-day Germans, Swiss, French, Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese. Although over the centuries there has been a great infusion of non-Israelite blood into these nations. The northern Scythian Israelites that settled in Scandinavia raided and established colonies in northern Europe, Britain, and Iceland. One group that settled in France became known as Northmen or Normans, and later during about 1066 AD invaded England under William the Conqueror, himself of Viking origin. One might ask, did any of these migrating Israelites that settled in Western Europe and the British Isles know where they came from? The answer is yes. The Scottish Declaration of Independence, drawn up in AD 1320, not only contains a record of the origin of these Scots, but indicated the route of their previous migrations. One part states, they came to Scotland by way of Scythia. We talked about that. 1,200 years after the people of Israel crossed the Red Sea. 1,200 years after that is about the approximate date where Scotland became a nation. And yet they came to their home in the West, and it says now where they still live today. Read that declaration sometime. Very interesting. I've had fun with that declaration. I mean, a lot of people in Scotland, they're very proud of being Scottish. I'm Scottish. You are? Oh, you're an Israelite. I'm no Jew. They shot. Wait a minute now. Your Declaration of Independence says you're an Israelite. Where does it say that? I have in the book. We had quite a few Scotsmen who accepted our message on that one point. I can't believe that one. It took more. I would take more than that. Now, those who study the evidence I presented now know the lost tribes of Israel were never really lost. They only lost their identity as they migrated west over the centuries. They were fulfilling a promise that God, through Jeremiah, told the people, "Hear the word of the Lord, O you nations, and declare it in the isles afar off, and say, He that scatters Israel will gather him and keep him as a shepherd doth his flock." Our Celto-Saxon ancestors, they settled first in Western Europe, Scandinavia, and the Isles in the West, in fulfillment of a God's promise now in the book of Samuel to David regarding his people. Quote, "Moreover, I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, they may dwell in a place of their own and move no more, neither shall the children of wickedness afflict them any more as before time." For since Israel was in Palestine, the time of that promise, it follows that the appointed place had to be somewhere else. We have followed them to that appointed place. And from out of that appointed place, and those Israelite people, have come our founding fathers as representatives of the tribe of Manasseh, the 13th tribe of Israel, of whom it was prophesied they would become a great nation And read sometime all the blessings that Joseph passed on to his son Ephraim and Manasseh. Read all these things. They fit America right down the line. We did become a great nation, one out of many. He played a few of them. These people, our pilgrim fathers, came with the Bible. They call themselves the seed of Abraham, God's servants, the children of Jacob, and his chosen. They found this nation as a Christian nation. Now I have a film out next year called The Faith of Our Fathers, showing this is founded on Christianity. Founded. One little point I'm interested. I've been told for years, Jamestown, forget Jamestown, it's all commercial, it's all business. There's no Christianity there at all. They do come for money, that's true. But a man I'm going to be contacting this year in Jamestown, or near there, a historian, went over to England, he found the original charter given to that group, and he found the admission propagation of Christianity. So now I got something I can throw back and put that in my film. Now, they based all their laws on the laws of the Bible. However, like our Israel ancestors, we have turned away in this day from God's laws. We've allowed the liberal, ungodly, and our midst to occupy seats of authority, to enslave in a corrupt financial system our people, to use our children as pawns in socialistic programs teaching immorality as an acceptable way of life. America, read the scriptures that state, "Know ye that the Lord is God, as he has made us, and not we ourselves." My favorite Bible verse, we are his people, and sheep of his pasture. But, like all sheep, we have gone astray. However, in spite of our going astray, we are Jacob Israel, of whom God promised through Jeremiah, "I shall be the God of all the families of Israel, and they shall be my people." So in spite of our unrighteousness and national rejection of God in this day, we are not being cast off. We're only being punished, chastised, which will only cease when we take the advice of Hosea, read now, "Come, let us return unto the Lord, for he hath torn, and he will heal us. He hath smitten, and he will bind us up." We who are Caucasians, Chameleons, Scythians at one time, now Anglo-Saxon, Normans, Scandinavians, Celts, kindred people, are Abraham's children, of whom God said, as long as the sun, moon, and stars exist, not if you behave yourself, anyway, as long as they exist, so will the descendants of Abraham continue as a nation before me. So how can they take that nation promise away from America, Israel? A nation created by Almighty God. He promised us, his people Israel, he will return and establish his kingdom on earth, and he shall reign over the house of Israel forever.